Hey everyone, and welcome to another Kanoa Reviews, where we review games both new and old on all platforms. If you like the content that I make, then please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you never miss a review when it comes out. Today we talk about the game Kane Lynch Dead Men. This game was released in the early years of the Xbox 360 and also PC, and was a third-person shooter made by the same studio that was responsible for many of the Hitman games. Now, I personally adore the Hitman game, so of course one would think that I would be interested in this title. But back when it was released, I remember it got very mediocre scores all across the board, and the footage that I saw of it was very ugly looking, I thought. Now, many years later, I bought the game on the Steam sale for less than $5 or so to go back in time and see if this game was indeed as bad as everyone says. Now, first of all, the game still has that outrageous games for Windows Live bullcrap, and it honestly makes it to where having DRM on games which are also single player is one of the worst things the game industry has done. Eventually I was able to get around it and play the damn game so I could finally grant my verdict. First, let's talk about the setting and story. Kane Lynch tells the story of two criminals as they escape from a prison transport, after which they get confronted with some old acquaintances of theirs, who demand payback for previous work they owed them. They even kidnap the family members of Kane and threaten to kill them if he does not give them what he owes. Next up, you'll be doing bank heists and kidnappings yourself in order to get what they want, but when all that fails, you eventually break out other criminals you know from a different prison and head out to Latin America to take out this criminal group by facing them head on. The game is heavily created around two-player co-op, but you can even feel this within the single player as well, but it's not as bad as you might think. In the single player, you play as Kane, and the characters like Lynch and other friendly units will be controlled by the AI. You can outfit the AI with certain weapons or give them simple orders like to attack a specific target or defend a certain area. There are a few times where both Kane and Lynch split up, and I assume that in multiplayer you have some separate moments where each focuses on something different, which I always like. Other games like Gears of War have this, where one player goes up and the other goes down through a building or street, and you feel that you are still partaking in the same operations or battle, but experiencing it from a different angle. The best thing in my opinion about Kane Lynch is the setting, but then only the setting of the first half of the game. The opening, for example, is pretty cool and hectic. You get rescued from the prison van by other masked criminals and need to fight your way from street to street, alley to alley, and building to building as you shoot incoming policemen and SWAT. The style and rawness of this whole ordeal really made me feel that a big inspiration for this game is the movie Heat with Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and Val Kilmer. The shootouts you have with the cops on the streets is very reminiscent like the shootouts and feel that movie has, and later on you even have a bigger fight on the streets of Tokyo where you move in between the cars as you mow down incoming law enforcement. This also feels like an homage or inspiration by the street shootout scene in Heat. Even in its sequel, Kane Lynch Dog Days, which I will review in the future as well, the end level takes place at an airport and has a section next to the landing strip at night, which is also very clearly inspired by the final scene of Heat. Now, Heat is a fantastic movie, and so I do have to say that I really love this hardcore setting of being two psychopathic criminals on the run from the law and mowing down anyone who comes in between us and escaping. There's honestly not a lot of games out there where you feel like a proper bank heister getting from one hectic job to the next. Games that come to mind are Payday 2 or GTA, but even in GTA, it's only with certain missions instead of the overall game. Having settings like a bank heist or a chase from the cops through the streets to a shootout in a nightclub are things that may sound cliche, but in reality, we have not seen it that much in shooters where we are the ones that are robbing the place or performing the crime. But as I said, the second half of the game has you travel to Latin America, and this is where the game really falls apart for me. And then we haven't even talked about the awful weapon mechanics in the game yet. During your trip to South America, you take part in a civil war with rebels against the military regime and fight through the streets and marketplaces until you seize the government building. After this, you head into the jungle and fight amongst the thick vegetation and go from outpost to outpost. It throws away that pretty original setting and concept and replaces it with the most cliché and boring setting imaginable. The last half of this game you have already experienced in many other games before and have seen it done way better and less boring and monotonous. I'm not kidding in that the last half felt really boring and tedious, despite it only probably being an hour. The game is not very long. You can easily complete it in 3 hours, and only 1.5 hours of those are interesting to me purely because of the setting that it takes place in. But even then, the game still comes with a lot of issues. Before talking about the gameplay issues, let's also tackle the graphics. The game looks ugly. It truly does. Textures are blurry, models really lack detail, and the only thing that can be said that is a bit of a positive about the graphical presentation is that there are some sections where a lot of units are on screen at once. During the nightclub shootout, you have hundreds of NPCs dancing and running around, and there's also a pretty entertaining level where you break out some friends from a prison and the entire prison is trying to escape with hundreds of inmates fleeing the perimeter. Originally, I actually thought that this game was one of the Xbox 360 launch titles, since during those times you always have those graphics that are not really up to par, since they often also have the same title coming out for the previous generation of consoles just to be safe. That is what this felt like, and I was shocked to find out that this game came out almost 2 years after the Xbox 360 was released. Then let's finally talk about the gameplay and one of the reasons why I thought this game was such a letdown. The shooting in this game is absolutely atrocious. The main issue with the shooting in Kane Lynch is the terrible bullet spread, to where you cannot be accurate with pretty much any weapon. Even if you aim at a certain enemy, bullets will still randomly go in different directions than what you are aiming at. In its sequel, they still have this horrible mechanic, but at least made the crosshair a lot bigger to let you know that you will probably hit your target somewhere in this large area. But with the first game, you have a pretty tightly animated crosshair and it's very inaccurate, literally, in what it portrays to where you shoot. The kickback on weapons is also terrible, to where you often have to just take pop shots to get rid of enemies instead of firing on them normally. And maybe one can argue that the kickback is realistic and they try to portray this, but a different third-person shooter that absolutely nails its combat mechanics is Spec Ops: The Line, which hopefully I will also review sometime soon. The weapons in that game also have kickback, but portray accurately where you will shoot, and the weapons therefore feel really good and fun to use. The shooting and fighting in Kane Lynch, on the other hand, is just outright tedious and is not at all fun. And when the shooting in a shooting game is not even close to good, then there's something really wrong. It also has some mechanics that just don't work all that well. You can snap to cover and fire from that position like you can do with Gears of War, but it all is just so stiff and mechanical that it doesn't flow as well as something like Gears, and therefore I was far more efficient in fighting the enemies by not using that feature. The game also does not have a reload button, which is weird for a shooter, and instead of pressing the reload button, your character will reload the gun after a few seconds of not opening fire. The game is a big mess overall, and it's a shame because there are some great ideas on paper. As said, the biggest thing that this game is going for it is that hard and raw criminal style of you really feeling like you are one of the bad guys. The environmental destruction is also very cool, with a lot of interactivity during the shootouts. Both Kane and Lynch are absolute douchebags though, but it makes for some fun role-playing or following a story you don't really identify yourself with, but are just along with it for the wild ride. But that ride comes to a screeching halt when you are fighting alongside a guerrilla war in the capital and eventually head to the jungle. Lastly, I should say that this game had quite some controversy behind it when it came out, since of course your main enemies were police officers, and there are plenty of scenes where innocent civilians can get caught in the crossfire. During the level in the nightclub, you have shootouts right then and there on the dance floor in between the regular people, and chances are likely that a bullet or two will find its target in a person not wielding a weapon. But the game does not punish you for it at all, and you could even mow down everyone if you think they were in your way. I think it's this portrayal of violence where you could shoot civilians without worry that created some controversy. But I feel like it's just again people exaggerating or picking targets, because in games like Payday or Hitman, which the last one is of course made by the same creator, you also shoot at cops and can kill civilians. Though the game punishes you there by depleting your score, but that's about it. Other than that, there is no real punishment, so it's weird to me how you don't really hear people about that, but then with Kane and Lynch, they make quite a fuss about it. Anyway, I don't think that having played Kane and Lynch has made me into a psychopath or has increased the chance of me trying to acquire a weapon and using it outside at random. I think that the game can still be pretty fun if played with a friend, and maybe even the first hour to hour and a half can actually be quite enjoyable as you both join on this wacky and wild crime adventure. But even with co-op, I can still see the second half being very dull, and there's also no real satisfying or rewarding ending. The game looks ugly, plays with stiff controls and mechanics, and the shooting is below average. The second half of the game is very cliche, boring, and feels rushed, and the only good thing that the game has going for it is that heat-inspired feel of the first hour to 2 hours. In the end, Kane Lynch Dead Man gets a 6.2. It barely keeps its head above water because of that pretty cool first hour, but other than that, there's something to dislike or frustrating around every corner. As mentioned before, I've also played its sequel, Kane Lynch Dog Days, so we will do a review on that as well soon. That game actually does a few things better than the first part, but also does some things way worse, so it's going to be interesting to see where that game stands compared to this first iteration.